Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a co-founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Pandemic Preparedness Caucus, I've taken every opportunity in hearings like this one to highlight the unique opportunity that we have before us to take the lessons learned through the COVID-19 pandemic and apply them in a way that better prepares our healthcare system to respond to future unknown threats to our public health. So I'm glad to see that the committee noticed some bipartisan policies for this hearing today, including my bill, the Disease X Act. But I am disappointed that the majority has decided to move forward with flat funding for the preparedness programs that sit within PAPA, as well as exclude numerous FDA supply chain policies. Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned with static funding that falls well short of what frontline health workers, public health experts, and infectious disease specialists have said is necessary to prevent another COVID-level pandemic. How many times did the predicted death toll change over the course of the pandemic? First, it was 50 to 60,000 deaths, then it was 100,000. Every month, the projection went higher, while we heard countless cases of nurses and doctors reusing masks and wearing trash bags to protect themselves as states raced against each other and the federal government for shipments of PPE, as hospitals begged ventilator companies for just one more machine to help keep patients alive. Now, 3.5 years later, after the first COVID case was discovered in the United States, more than 1 million Americans have tragically lost their lives to the virus. We can and we should be looking for ways to do better moving forward to ensure that we're never caught flat-footed again. I'm grateful to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who recognize the importance and the urgency in achieving that goal. Last week, I introduced the Disease X Act alongside Dr. Burgess, Congressman Crenshaw, and Congresswoman Lee to establish a Disease X medical countermeasures program at BARDA for unknown viral threats with pandemic potential. Current funding constraints at BARDA only allow the agency to go so far. With much of BARDA's MCM development work focused on a defined list of chemicals, biological, radiological, and nuclear threat agents, as well as influenza, we may not be prepared to develop and manufacture at scale future drugs and vaccines against unknown viral threats that can lead to devastating pandemics. The Disease X Act will help BARDA to fully focus on their full list of priorities, including an increased emphasis on emerging infectious diseases with pandemic potential. Ms. Arthur, BIO supported the introduction of the Bipartisan Disease X Act, and I'm hoping you can explain the importance of this bill given the difference in the threat landscape now compared with the last PAPA reauthorization.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Trahan, for introducing that bill. This is actually an opportunity to do activities in R&D and manufacturing scale-up during the interpandemic period that could make us better prepared in the future. We actually learned this lesson even if you look at our response to monkeypox. The great investments made by the partnership between industry and BARDA and the NIH to make the smallpox antivirals and the smallpox vaccines actually allowed us, because of that viral family, to have the products for Mpox that we needed. So taking that same approach here, we would actually work on platform technologies, monoclonal antibodies, and mechanisms for new oral antivirals, and put those to work against a host of known pandemic threats. Mm-hmm. And then those particular products might result in products for known threats, but actually would allow us to respond maybe within 100 days to an unknown threat.
And just continuing on with the proposed Disease X program at BARDA, how important do you think it will be to have dedicated funding authorized for this program rather than just pulling funding from BARDA's general medical countermeasures pot?
We think it's actually very important that this have its own dedicated funding line. If that's not possible, although we think that's the right approach, really scaling up BARDA's overall number to more like what's in the FEMC multi-year budget, $1.5 to $1.6 billion, would give them the flexibility to work on what we know is already part of their strategy, which is to do platform agnostic work around viral families. So a separate line item would be optimal, but scaling up the budget would also be important.
Thank you, Ms. Arthur. Everyone here today represents a family who lost a loved one to COVID-19, and each of us represents a small business owner who was forced to close their doors, some for good, because of the emergency. We represent children who lost out on a valuable in-person learning so that they could keep themselves and their families safe when we knew next to nothing about the virus. So as members of this committee, we have an obligation to take lessons learned from the past 3 years and make investments now to prevent another catastrophic pandemic. And the Disease Act will help us get there. So I look forward to working with members of the committee to pass this legislation with the funding it requires. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.